We are wrapping up a series this weekend as we have been studying through the life of Joseph in the Old Testament, and the name of the series has been Overcome What's Holding You Back. And we've just been talking through some things in life that have a way of keeping us down and holding us back. Last week I mentioned that earlier in the month I took my wife to the Smoky Mountains just for a little getaway. Did a little hiking. We haven't done much of that, certainly not experienced hikers, but it was the second day we were there. We were on this rather isolated trail and hadn't seen anyone. We heard this noise about 20 feet in front of us over to the right. It was in the woods. And it was a very surreal moment as this rather large black bear crossed right in front of the trail that we were hiking. I'd heard about this thing happening. I thought it was just something people said to make it more exciting. I didn't actually think it would happen, and yet here's this bear, and I look over at my wife, and she seems fine. She just has this kind of quiet confidence about her that says, I don't have to outrun my husband, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun my husband, and she knew she could do that, so she wasn't worried. And I started thinking about what I had that I could use as self-defense. So I do an inventory of what's in my backpack. I'm thinking, okay, well, I've got a payday bar. I don't know if bears like paydays, but I got a payday bar. I've got a couple of water bottles. I've got a phone charger, one of the essentials, of course, and then a journal. That's it. That's all I had, and not exactly what you need for a survival situation, but I'm at least trying to think of some kind of MacGyver-like weapon that I could put together on the fly to protect us from the bear just in case it engages. And then I remembered that on my phone, I had downloaded this book called The Worst Case Scenario Survival Handbook. And I thought I remembered seeing a chapter in this book about what to do if you encounter a bear. So I pulled out my phone, start researching. What do you do if you encounter a bear in the Smoky Mountains? My wife's like, why are you on your phone? There was a bear right there. Why are you on your phone? I'm like, I'm researching. I'm trying to figure out what we should do in this situation. She's like, I'm pretty sure step one is not research what to do if you see a bear. Like, that's probably not the first thing it's gonna tell you. She said, this is that part in the movie where it all goes wrong. Put your phone up. But I know my strength. Like, there's some men, they're experienced hunters or hikers or survivors. I'm a researcher. It's what I do. It's what I do. And I don't want to brag, but within a matter of seconds, I had this article pulled up, and I was reading what you do in a situation like we are in fact in. And the first thing they do is tell you what to do if you're being attacked by a bear. That didn't seem to be happening. The bear was not coming towards us. But what I was immediately struck by is how counterintuitive the plan was. It just didn't make sense. Like, if a bear is coming at you, it said that you should not run away, that you should not climb a tree, that you should, in fact, lie still and be quiet. But that is not what you would feel like doing in that moment. Like, it doesn't matter if that's what you're supposed to do. It's not what you would want to do. Everything in you would say you got to run, but the instructions say if you want to survive this, if you want to overcome this, here's the way you do it. You lay still, you be quiet. Well, the bear seemed aware of our presence, but it certainly wasn't coming towards us. I mean, we weren't feeling threatened. And so I kept reading, and it said that if the bear knows you're there, that here's what you should do. I'll just read this directly from the book. It said that you want to make your presence known by talking loudly, clapping, and singing. And I thought, I can do all those things. I am positioned to rescue us from this bear, and so immediately I start trying to think of a song. What song's appropriate here? I mean, how do we want to score this whole situation? And I'm trying to think of the song to sing, and we had just seconds earlier, we had been talking about the fact that my niece was going to play the part of Annie in the musical Annie. And so I had some of that music, in my head, and for some reason, the song that came to my mind, a song that I knew by heart, I can't explain why, I'm a little embarrassed to tell you, but it's the song, "The Sun Will Come Out Tomorrow." And so I just start singing it. I'm trying to get her to sing along with me, but I'm trying to sing this like an adorable redheaded orphan. I'm giving it everything I have, trying to get this bear just to be aware that we're there, and I get the fact that that's, if my wife probably didn't feel that protected. Like if the man that's supposed to protect you is on his phone singing show tunes from the musical Annie, it just doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. But hey, we're here, we survived, so you're welcome, honey. It all worked out. And I went back to my cabin and I kept going through that book, looking at different worst case scenario moments, and one of the things that seemed very consistent is that each moment required you to do something that you didn't want to do. Each moment called on you to do something that was counterintuitive, something that you didn't feel like doing. So if we could put it this way, overcoming often requires you to do what you don't want to do. That oftentimes the best thing to do is the last thing you want to do or you feel like doing. And that's what we've seen again and again as we've studied through the life of Joseph. He overcomes a lot of obstacles and a lot of adversity, but he does so by walking in obedience, by being faithful, by not doing what might have felt most natural at the time. So he overcomes hurt. How does he do that? Well, he doesn't do it by blaming other people or by playing the victim. That would have been natural. That when you're hurt, the most natural thing to do is to feel sorry for yourself and to focus on what's been done to you. That's the natural thing to do. It's not what Joseph does. Joseph rises above that. He releases the past. He moves forward. And Joseph overcomes temptation, but how does he do it? He doesn't overcome it by giving into it or even by fighting it, but by running away from it, by fleeing it. That's how he survived. That's how he overcame. He overcomes discouragement not by wallowing in the discouragement or using it as an excuse for apathy and not really getting much done in his life, but he does what is just counterintuitive. If you're discouraged, you don't feel like being thankful, but Joseph is thankful. When you're discouraged, you don't feel like getting out and being active. You feel like staying in and keeping to yourself, but Joseph is proactive, and he is faithful to what God has called him to for that season of his life. And Joseph overcomes the trappings of success, not by stepping into the spotlight, which that's what would have felt natural, to kind of embrace the applause, but he doesn't do that. And instead, he steps back from it, and he recognizes that any success he has is because of God's hand and it's for God's glory. And he overcomes bitterness, as we'll see, not by taking revenge or getting even. Certainly that feels natural. When you are bitter because of something someone has done to you, the most natural thing is to try to even the score. It's not what Joseph does. Instead, he extends grace and he extends forgiveness. But I'm telling you, it's not because he felt like it. And I know that that's where a lot of you are at. Like you're facing some obstacles, and what God is calling you to do is not something you feel like doing. I get it. You don't feel like forgiving him. Not after what he's done. And you don't feel like forgiving her, not after what she said. But you got to understand that the longer you wait, the longer your bitterness is going to take hold. It's going to hold you back. I understand that you don't feel like asking for help. I mean, the natural thing to do if you're struggling with something is to try to keep it a secret. And maybe it seems like the worst thing that could happen is for somebody else to find out. You don't want to ask for help. But it's holding you back. The struggle is keeping you from moving forward. And so even though you don't feel like it, even though you don't want to do it, you need to ask for some help. Some of you came here this weekend, and that's the message God has for you. You've tried to do this on your own. You've tried to overcome it with your own strength. You can't. If you could have, you would have done it by now. You need some help. It doesn't feel natural to be thankful when you're going through difficult times, especially if it's not fair or it's not your fault. You feel like being angry and being resentful, but it's holding you back and it's keeping other people away. And so as we talk about Joseph's life, just understand that again and again, he challenges us to do something that doesn't necessarily feel natural. We don't necessarily want to do it. So just a quick recap of his life as we wrap up this series. We meet Joseph as a 17-year-old young man. God gives him this dream that he is going to make a difference with his life. And in this dream, and he tells his brothers about it, that his brothers are all bowing down and worshiping him. So we learned if you have dreams like that, don't tell your siblings. But Joseph does. He tells his brothers about this dream, and they sell him. They're tired of kind of the favoritism that Joseph has received and kind of the entitlement attitude that he has. And so it's a little drastic, but they sell him into slavery. And he is taken to this foreign land of Egypt where he is bought by a man named Potiphar. And so he serves as Potiphar's slave and starts to do well. Things start to be looking up a little bit for him. He gets more responsibility. It seems like he's making a difference with his life, even though he's a slave. And then Potiphar's wife becomes infatuated with Joseph, and yet Joseph won't have anything to do with her. She feels scorned and she feels rejected, so she falsely accuses him of making unwanted sexual advancements. Joseph is thrown into prison, really more of a dungeon. There's no release date. There's no appeal process. He's in there most likely to die. And so you read this journey that Joseph goes on, and it's just one obstacle after another. It's one setback after another. But as we saw throughout that season, we see this phrase again and again in the text that the Lord was with Joseph. 4 different times we're told the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. And it's as if the writer knew that when we read it, we would begin to wonder, is the Lord with Joseph? Because it kind of seems like he's not. If God was with Joseph, then why would he have to go through what he's going through? And this is just something that we struggle with. We want to determine God's presence by our circumstances. We want to look around at what we're going through and say, well, if God is with me, then I shouldn't have to deal with this, and I shouldn't have to go through that, and this person wouldn't be this way. We want to determine God's presence by things going smoothly, and yet the Bible says again and again, and then again and again in Joseph's life, the Lord was with him. It may not have seemed like it in the moment, but he was. And it may not feel like it right now, but he is. See, a lot of us want the dream, but we don't want to have to deal with the difficulties. We want the opportunities, but we don't want to have to deal with obstacles. We want the strength, but we don't want to have to lift any weights. And that's just not how it works. So Joseph goes through this difficult season, but then he has this moment 13 years after he was in prison, where at the age of 30, he's brought before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh has a couple of dreams, and Joseph says, I know what the dreams mean. The dreams mean that there are going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh, during these next 7 years of plenty, you've got to prepare for the 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh says, you got the job. And so Joseph is put in charge of literally all of Egypt. He's made governor of Egypt. And Pharaoh says to Joseph in chapter 41, verse 44, no one will lift a hand or a foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval. And so literally within an afternoon, Joseph goes from the prison to a palace. And so for 13 years, we read the Lord was with Joseph, the Lord was with Joseph, and we're not sure because it sure doesn't seem like it. And then in an afternoon, everything changes. And I think Joseph sensed that this was it. This was the fulfillment of the dream. In fact, in last week we saw in verse 51 that when Joseph's firstborn son Manasseh was born, Joseph named him Manasseh because his name means God has made me forget my troubles. God has made me forget my father's household. Seems like he's moving on. And yet you have to wonder if sometimes at night, when he was by himself, he just remembered what was done to him, remembered how his brothers had abandoned him and rejected him and betrayed him. He doesn't have time to really think about the past because of so much responsibility. He spends the next 7 years of prosperity storing up grain, preparing for the famine. And then once the famine begins, Joseph then is in charge of dispersing the grain so that it will last throughout the 7-year famine. And then one day, he's seen thousands of people, and then one day he's meeting people who need help, and he can see in line his 10 brothers, 10 of his brothers. They're there asking for help. They need assistance. They don't recognize Joseph. He recognizes them. We read in verse 6, it says, so when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. And suddenly Joseph remembers his dream as a 17-year-old boy of his brothers bowing down and worshiping him, and this is the moment. And there's a lot of different ways he could have gone here. He could have arrested them and had them executed. No one would have questioned his authority. He could have taken the high road and just sent them back home with maybe just enough food for survival. But he counts 10 and he realizes his younger brother, the youngest of the brothers, Benjamin, isn't with them. And he wants to make sure Benjamin is okay. And he perhaps wonders, have they done the same thing to him that they did to me? And so he puts them through a series of tests to try to find out who he's dealing with here. And he takes them prisoners. He accuses them of being spies. Eventually, he tells his brothers that they can all go back home except for one has to be held as a hostage, and they're to bring Benjamin back as a way of evidence that their story is true. And so eventually they're going to do this, but as they're talking about what's happening to them, they do so in the presence of Joseph. They don't realize Joseph can speak their language. And so here's the conversation that Joseph overhears with his brothers. They say to one another, "Surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life. But we would not listen, and that's why this distress has come upon us, and now we must give an accounting for his blood." And so Joseph perhaps realizes that they realize what they had done, that they have some understanding of the pain that they had caused. And you get this sense that for 22 years, these brothers had been in a prison of their own because of guilt and shame, because of the secret that they were trying to keep. And they think, okay, now the bill is coming due. Now we're gonna have to pay for what we did to Joseph. They return with the youngest brother. You can go home and read about this starting in Genesis 44. They return with the youngest brother, and Joseph has a dinner for all of them, and he seats them from oldest to youngest. And I think he's just doing this to mess with them a little bit, because how could Joseph know the age of the brothers and who was the oldest and who was the youngest? But he seats them from oldest to youngest, and then after the dinner, he puts a silver cup in Benjamin's travel bag to make it look like Benjamin is stealing. And he threatens to keep Benjamin as a prisoner, and then one of the older brothers, Judah, steps in. And Judah says, don't keep Benjamin as a prisoner. Take me instead. Judah says, I sacrifice my life for Benjamin's freedom. That's Judah. Now you go down the line a little bit and you find out that one of Judah's ancestors eventually would do the same thing. That Jesus from the line of Judah would come, and Jesus would say, I sacrifice my life for your freedom, for my freedom. So Judah steps in and says, I give my life for my brother Benjamin. I can't go back and tell my father, not after what happened to Joseph, I can't go back and tell my father that Benjamin is not with us. And so Joseph is just moved by what's happened, by the sacrificial gesture. He can no longer control his emotions. Here's what we read, chapter 45, verse 1. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all the attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him and Pharaoh's household heard about it. And you start to wonder if maybe Joseph hadn't actually forgotten about his father's household. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come closer to me. And when they had done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. That one. In case you're confusing me with another brother that you might have sold to another country. Yeah, so the guy that you sold into slavery, yeah, that's me, I'm him. And so he reminds them immediately, I'm Joseph, the person you sold into slavery, into Egypt. And now he says, verse 5, and do not be distressed though. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, it was God who sent me here. So don't miss what's happening. Joseph begins by identifying himself by what had been done to him. I'm Joseph, you sold me into slavery. You abandoned me, you rejected me. I'm Joseph, you abused me. He begins by